Chapter 23 of Paul the Dauntless. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by David Leeson. Paul the Dauntless by Basil Joseph Mathews. Chapter 23. The Scorn of Athens. Paul was in Athens. The sleepy Roman sentinel, as he glanced under his proud, heavy eyelids at the travel-stained Paul in his cloak and sandals, could never guess that the greatest man in the world of that day had at that moment entered the most learned and brilliant city in the Roman Empire. Still more wildly absurd would it have seemed to the sentry if a passing prophet had told him that, when all the worship of the gods of Athens had vanished like morning mist, and when the last century of the Roman Empire had fallen behind her broken walls, the worship which Paul that day brought into the city would endure and spread to the ends of the earth. Though the long street from the Piraeus gate to the heart of the city was crowded, Paul was very lonely. Up the street went merchants riding on asses with slaves running alongside, coming up from the port. Greek mothers led their children along the shaded sidewalk, with its marble pillars, past the little wooden shops where you might buy figs and dates, olives and oil, and goat's milk cheese. Here a mother stopped to bargain with the crafty merchant for a length of buff-coloured linen for a tunic for her boy who had grown out of his old one. There a man stopped at the armourer's to test the blade of a Damascene sword. Lusty Romans, keen-witted Greeks, olive-skinned Syrians, swarthy Egyptians, rubbed shoulders with Paul as he walked up the street, but they only made him feel more utterly alone. For he longed greatly for his old friend Silas and his son Timothy, the companions with whom he had tramped the open road and sailed and shared meals and prison for so many days. He hoped that they would hurry to him when they heard his message. Paul's feet carried him on the next Sabbath to the door of the Jews' meeting house, where he spoke to them after the word had been read. The Jews, and the Greeks who had come to believe in Jehovah, listened eagerly to the new truths that Paul poured forth. On other days he walked about the streets and markets of Athens through the hot August days. The sun was climbing over the Aegean Sea when Paul would issue forth in the cool of the morning. He always loved cities and all the shifting, many-coloured scenes of the streets. He preferred them to the country. So we can best imagine that he would not walk out to listen to the bees droning in the sunshine over the purple heather of Hymettus, gathering the very honey of the gods. Nor would he stroll by the Ilissus stream that ran by the hill of Hymettus and watered the grove of the Lyceum, under whose shade Aristotle in the old days had taught his disciples. Paul would, we can believe, be drawn to the great marble stadium between Hymettus and the city, where he could see the crowds of Athenians, with a sparkling of country people and sailors, watching the sports about which he wrote again and again in his letters. The wrestlers, the brawny boxers, and the lithe running men, in their short white tunics, trained there for the great Pan-Athenaic games which drew people from all the countryside to Athens. The shouts surged to the sky as the teams of straining horses, white with sweat, thundered round the course, with the drivers in their reeling chariots cracking their long whips above the maddened horses' heads. Walking from the stadium toward the city, Paul would see the giant temple of Jupiter Olympus rearing its gleaming marble columns, and beyond, in the distance, he could see the still lovelier Parthenon, set like a priceless jewel on the Acropolis. Coming along the street around the foot of the Acropolis, he would see the black Nubian slaves, and maybe British ones also, waiting outside the theatre of Dionysius, which was cut in the living rock on the south side of the hill and facing the distant sea. The chattering Athenian audience came pouring from the theatre discussing the actors and the play. The slaves ran with their draped and gilded litters for the ladies. The long-robed priests, for whom the 70 marble seats in the front row were reserved, might be arguing with some Epicurean philosophers as to whether drama ought to reveal truth or should simply give pleasure. Doubtless they would come to the conclusion that, in this great play of Aeschylus which they had watched, the author had given them both truth and pleasure. As Paul passed along he saw many altars on which men left their offerings, this man in order that the god Mercury should protect him while travelling, or this mother that Aesculapius should make her sick boy well again, and that youth that Venus should give him success in love, or Diana bring skill in hunting, or Minerva grant courage in war. And Paul saw one strange altar on which was carved, "To an unknown God." When Paul climbed the steep way up the one approach to the Acropolis, and passed through gate after gate on to the shining summit, he was face to face with the loveliest building in the world, the Parthenon. It stood there looking out over Athens to the sea, perfect in its exquisite proportions, with its lovely pillars and shaded portico, and the marvellous sculptures of dancing youths and maidens, priests, warriors and horses, oxen and garlands. And within the Parthenon was the gigantic statue of Athena, the goddess of wisdom, whose special care was thought to be over this city named after her. Paul felt a stirring within him as he looked on the altars of Athens and thought of the countless gods whom the people worshipped. For he knew that in truth all the power that the people believed to dwell in Athena and Aesculapius and the other gods really belonged only to the one God whose image could not be carved with hands, who is wisdom and health and love and justice. This was the most learned city in all the world, yet Paul knew with a clear flaming certainty that he had a truth which contained and surpassed all the truth its scholars knew. He could see that what these Athenian worshippers of 3,000 idols desired to know was life. Yes, to know the real truth and the way to live. And Paul was quite sure that Jesus Christ was the way and the truth and the life. Paul went down from the Acropolis and passed the sacred rock cleft in which the Furies dwelt, went by the holy place under which Agamemnon's bones lay buried, beyond the hill where the high council of the Areopagus sat in judgment, and walked under a beautifully carved marble archway into the Agora, the market-place. The hum of busy voices fell on Paul's ears, men chaffering over the price of their wares, selling and buying fish from the Aegean Sea, woolen stuff from the Greek hill villages, purple cloths from Tyre, earthen jars and pitchers and dishes, lovely glass vessels from Sidon. There were cheese and olives, bread and wine for the housewives, for the students of the university parchment and vellum and wax tablets. On a raised platform slaves lounged in the sun, while the auctioneer knocked them down to the highest bidder. On one side of the marketplace Paul saw a group of men in long white robes fringed with purple and blue and yellow, talking in a secluded shaded place, where there were no booths. Some of the elder men rested on a marble seat; younger men stood listening. The younger men were students at this University of Athens. They had come from all over the empire to get wisdom — men from Rome and Corinth, Ephesus and Tarsus, Antioch and Damascus. One or another of them would occasionally, after a ripple of laughter had gone round the group, make a note of a smart saying with his pointed ivory stylus on his wax tablet. Paul went near to the group and listened. They were arguing, using long difficult words about very high thoughts. Some of them said that God was simply all the life that there is in trees and animals and men, all the force that drives the winds and the seas. The world that we see is the garment of that serene, unfeeling power which is God. Man should aim, these Stoics said, at reaching a like serene freedom from feelings of mere pain or pleasure. Paul knew their arguments very well. Indeed, he probably knew all about them when he was quite young in his native place, Tarsus. For in Tarsus University itself this way of looking at things, called the Stoic philosophy, had been taught for many years. " Our teacher Epicurus teaches us," one of the speakers on the other side might say, " that we must first believe that God is a being blessed and immortal, according to the notion of a God commonly held amongst men; and, so believing, you will not say anything about him that is contrary to everlasting life and to happiness. Men should aim, not to be above feeling, as you Stoics say, but to take pleasure, not in wild excesses, but in quietly seizing each moment and pressing out all the happiness that it can give." Then the Epicurean ceased, and a Stoic asked him clever questions that would lead him into contradicting himself if he was not very careful. This way of arguing by asking questions they called the Socratic method, because a very great thinker, Socrates, had used it in Athens centuries before Paul was there. Paul's brain was keen and his tongue was swift. He had not listened long before he dropped a question that made the Greek debaters turn to see whose was this new voice. His eyes flashed keenly as he met and answered the questions that came back swiftly to him. We do not know exactly what he said to them, but he certainly spoke about Jesus and his resurrection, and argued that Jesus alone really told men the nature of God for which they were groping. They saw from his face and his clothes that he was not a university man. Some thought he must be just a half-educated crank from the provinces. " What would this smatterer say? " sneered one. " He seems to be talking about some foreign gods," said another. They felt superior to this outsider, but their curiosity got the better of them, for the Athenians loved nothing better than to hear the latest craze from the East. So the leaders decided to take him from the clamour of the marketplace to a quieter spot, where Paul could explain the whole of his new teaching without distraction. " Come," they said, as they took hold of his arm and led him away, " let us know what is this new teaching that you are talking about, for you have brought some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, just what these things mean." They led him toward a long sloping rocky hill called the Areopagus, a few hundred yards away to the south of the marketplace. In the side of the hill and facing the marketplace, a little plateau had been cut in the living rock. It was in the shadow comparatively early in the day, and was quiet. Here the men paused, Athenian and foreign, grouped round, stylus in hand, to listen, and behind them the crowd of inquisitive loiterers waited, listening. Among them was a woman from a foreign land whose name was Damaris. Paul had had little time to prepare what he would say to this learned and critical audience, but his brain went swift and sure to the very thing that would grip their attention and make them feel that he understood their minds. " Men of Athens," he began, " I see at every turn that you are unusually given to the worship of deities. As I walked along and scanned the objects of your worship, I actually came upon an altar bearing this inscription, ' To an unknown God.' What you worship in ignorance I proclaim to you. God," he continued, appealing to the belief of the Stoics and Epicureans, " the God who made the world and all things in it, He, as Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in shrines made with human hands." Paul would point to the lovely temple of Theseus that shone in the sunlight on a hill beyond the marketplace. " He is not served by human hands," continued Paul, " as if He needed anything. For it is He who gives life and breath and all things to all men. He has made of one nature all nations of men, to live over the earth, fixing their allotted periods and the boundaries of their abodes, meaning them to seek for God on the chance of finding Him in their groping for Him. But indeed this God is close to each one of us, for it is in Him that we live and move and exist, as some of your own poets have said, for His very offspring we are." The wise Athenians must have raised their eyes in surprise to hear this Jew quoting their own poets. Paul may well have learned at Tarsus this maxim of the poem from which he quoted. For Cleanthes, who was a Stoic philosopher, had more than 300 years earlier written a poem which was known wherever the Greek language was spoken. It ran: " God most glorious, called by many a name, Nature's great King, through endless years the same, Omnipotent, who by thy just decree Controllest all, hail Zeus, for unto thee Behoves it mortals in all lands to call, We are thine offspring." " After all," we can imagine some of them saying, " this Jew has more in him than we had expected. He knows something of our philosophy and our poets." Paul went on, with the men sitting chin in hand listening. "Well, as the race of God, we ought not to imagine that the divine nature resembles gold or silver or stone, the graven product of human art and invention. The ages of such ignorance God overlooked, but He now charges men that they all everywhere do repent, inasmuch as He has fixed a day on which He will judge the world justly by a man whom He has destined for this, and He has given proof of this to all by raising Him from the dead." " Absurd !" cried some of his hearers, stung into interruption by the mad notion, as it seemed to them, of anyone who had once been dead ever being raised to life again, and some of them laughed at him. One man, however, a member of the court called after the Areopagus, sat quiet, meditating. His name was Dionysius. He saw at a glance how true Paul's speech had been, up till those strange last words. Might not that tale too of Paul's about the resurrection be true? After all, if God made men, surely he could bring one again from the dead. The meeting broke up, and the men strolled back to the agora with some joking word about wasting time on the mad ideas of a Jew, whose speech they would forget in a week. But that speech is now the most famous in all history, while the very names of those men are forgotten, except the one who was now waiting to speak with Paul. " I would like to hear more of this teaching," said Dionysius the Areopagite. In the background the woman, Damaris, also lingered, wishing to know more from Paul's lips. These two, with some others, sat with Paul while he, with all his soul in his words, poured out the story of how God had shown His love to the whole world by giving His Son Jesus to live and love and die for men, and had shown that Jesus was indeed His Son and the true Saviour of men by raising Him from the grave. At last Paul's time was up. He had come in August and it was still early autumn. His stay had measured only weeks. Nor had he been persecuted. But the Voice called him onward from the icy flippancy of Athens, telling him he could do better work in another place. He girt his tunic about his loins and grasping his stick once more made his way down the long street and out through the Piraeus gate, until the waters of the harbour were at his feet. He boarded one of the many boats going westward up the gulf to Cenchrea, the eastern landing place of Corinth. And men today do not judge Paul with the sneering judgment that the wise men of Athens passed upon him. They rather judge the Athenians of that day by their failure to know the supreme greatness of the hero and saint who now left their gates forever. Of all the men who ever spoke in Athens the greatest were Socrates and Paul. Athens slew Socrates by poison. It froze Paul out with a laugh. End of chapter 23.